All right. Well, welcome everyone to the Tenement Museum's book talk tonight, featuring a square meal, a culinary history of the Great Depression. I'm Dave Favaloro, the Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Tenement Museum, and I'm glad to be with you virtually tonight. Before we get started, let me thank you for tuning in. If you're watching this event live, you can ask questions and add comments throughout the event to myself or to our speaker this evening. We'll have dedicated time, of course, at the end for answering questions, but feel free to ask and pose those throughout the event. If you're not familiar with the Tenement Museum, we're a museum that tells the stories of immigrants, migrants, and refugees in the United States, and we're a history museum located in New York's Lower East Side. We feature stories that lie oftentimes at the intersection of food and migration, which will be the heart of our conversation this evening. Immigrant families and migrant families there often found creative ways to feed their families, sometimes in very difficult times. In this vein, we're very excited to be speaking tonight with renowned food historian and author Jane Ziegelman about her book, A Square Meal, A Culinary History of the Great Depression. The book is available for sale, and we're partnering with independent bookseller, McNally Jackson, for book purchases. We'll talk throughout our conversation tonight about how the crises of the early 20th century shaped Americans' eating habits. In wartime and economic depression, what did immigrants cook? And how did US-born Americans view the food made by their immigrant neighbors? What can we learn from those frugal cooks today? And very generously, Jane will also share some of her favorite recipes, I think, that speak in an important way to those stories with us this evening. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker tonight, Jane Ziegelman. Jane is the author of the James Beard Award-winning A Square Meal, Culinary History of the Great Depression, which she co-wrote with her husband, Andrew Coe. She's also author of the best-selling 97 Orchard, an edible history of 5 immigrant families in one New York tenement. Of course, that tenement happens to be at the heart of the Tenement Museum, so we share lots of common ground, and we'll get into that throughout the course of our conversation tonight. And I remember when 97 Orchard came out, and you're doing some research at the Tenement Museum, and so reading A Square Meal, I wanted to, I thought quite a bit about what moved you to delve into this topic. What was it that first interested you about writing about the culinary history of the Great Depression? What sparked that idea for you? Yeah, what was it that kicked you into this really interesting research and book project?
Sure. Well, living in a household with 2 food historians, my husband Andy and me, you can imagine, we talk a lot about food. And really the idea for the Great Depression book came out of a particularly animated conversation. And it was a bit of a lightning bolt out of the blue. When I started working on the book, it felt like I was branching off into completely new terrain. At the same time, one of the focal points of 97 Orchard is how, under very tough conditions, immigrants got food on the table. And of course, that's entirely relevant to the Depression story. So, in a sense, they're both food books that are also about hunger. And what intrigued me so much about the Depression story, and still intrigues me, is that it was really the first time in this country that Americans experienced hunger on such a large scale. And it was something, it turns out, they were completely unprepared for. We were completely unprepared for.
That's such an interesting point, because so much of the history of immigration and migration and food has been about, right, the encounter of newcomers with a certain kind of abundance, right? A lot of historians of food write about the relative availability of meat here in the United States as compared to, say, a variety of European countries. from which immigrants hailed in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And so that's really interesting to think about it in that way, that this is sort of the Depression represents kind of a juncture point in that history.
Absolutely. You know, what happens when the land of limitless abundance runs out? It didn't exactly run out, but what happens when the abundance seems to evaporate?
Right. Well, you know, one of the things that, excuse me, connects your book about the Depression and the 97 Orchard book is, of course, the story of a family, immigrant family whose story we tell on a regular basis, the Tenement Museum. And so we're going to kind of introduce our viewers to that family and share some photos as a way to kind of launch us into that part of the conversation about how immigrant families experience the Depression from a culinary or food perspective. So I'm going to bring up some of these photos, and for viewers who may have visited the museum previously, who have taken our Hard Times tour, are familiar with the story of the Baldy family. Up on the screen here, I have Josephine BaldyEsposito, who was the child of Italian immigrants, Sicilian from Palermo, who was born in New York City on the Lower East Side, essentially, in the mid-1920s. And lived with her family, her brother Johnny and her parents, Adolfo and Rosaria, in the early 1930s. And this is a photo of Josephine in the late 1980s, standing in the hallway of 97 Orchard Street, which really was one of her childhood homes. And then here, of course, is Josephine and her younger brother by a year, Johnny, on the roof of 97 Orchard. And so, you know, one of the things we want to talk about is what it was like for this particular family. The children, in this particular case of Sicilian immigrants from Palermo, living through the Depression, only having recently arrived in the United States, particularly from a food perspective. Up on the screen here now is the father, Adolfo Baldy, some years after the family left 97 Orchard Street, and he was a skilled woodworker, a cabinet maker, and this is a wood carved sort of inlaid skyline of New York City, just to sort of give you a sense of his handiwork. He found intermittent work during the Depression, and one of the things we'll talk about is how this particular family availed themselves of some of the relief made available. And his wife, Rosaria, here, standing on the roof of 97 Orchard, and what was her days like, what was her life like, and what were the kinds of things that she was cooking during this period, which I think, you know, your book really hits on in an important way, and I think in an interesting way, really kind of stands at the intersection of your work. And then up on the screen here, I have this recipe that you shared that you really thought connected to the story of the Baldys during the Depression. So if you wouldn't mind, would you mind telling us the story of this recipe, this kind of beautiful, most cooks, right, will know the sort of appearance of the kind of stained recipe card here, the telltale.
Yeah, no, that's exactly the word that I use to describe them, is beautiful, because they have all the stains of time on them. And you can see these were foods that were cooked and they were loved, and that's all there in those images. This is a recipe for stuffed peppers that comes to me from my very good friend, Steve Treffinger, whose mom was a fantastic Italian-American cook. And I had the honor of eating at their place many times. And we're going to be talking, I mean, the reason I chose this recipe is because it illustrates the Italian genius for using humble ingredients. And that includes stale bread, which are made into breadcrumbs, And the Sicilians, Southern Italians, have a vast repertoire of breadcrumb-based dishes. This is one of them, and it happens to be a really exciting one. And we will revisit the recipe again, right?
Yes, yeah, in a
Yes.
moment we'll play a really terrific video that you shared of you cooking cooking this particular dish. And I want to also mention we'll be sharing the recipe as well in the chat for folks who want to have a closer look at that. And it's also really reminiscent. I want to point out to a recipe that Josephine BaldyEsposito's daughter Maria shared with the museum, in which we talk about on in some of our more food related programming, which will be shared in some of the kind of online virtual things the museum is doing in the coming days as well. So yeah, a lot of kind of connective tissue there, I think.
Yes.
So I'm going to bring up the video here and hit play. And if you want to kind of take us through what you're doing in this video here, kind of live narrate sort of the recipe here. So I'll hit
The
play. There you
recipe
go.
is, yeah, we're going. I wanted you to see the kind of peppers that are used. They're jarred pickled peppers, and they can be either hot or sweet. And here I am decapitating them and emptying them of seeds, and that's getting them ready for the breadcrumb stuffing. And I should add that the breadcrumbs have been seasoned. They've been lightly toasted in a pan with olive oil and with chopped olives, anchovies, garlic, and parsley. So they're absolutely bursting with flavor. And as you can see, there's a lot of, this recipe takes some fussing, but it's fun. The first thing we do is, after the peppers are stuffed, is cook them in a generous amount of olive oil, so the oil becomes flavored. To that flavored oil, we add tomato sauce, and you may have noticed it was Hunt's brand tomato sauce, because
Okay.
that's what Anna Treffinger called for. So I wanted to honor her in that way by using her favorite brand. The peppers are then returned to the pan and put into the oven for 45 minutes. So when they emerge, they're absolutely meltingly soft and really hot. I mean, spicy hot. It's a really fun dish.
Right. Yeah, it looks really really wonderful. And I think, the thing that I'm just going to take this off of the screen now and return us back, being able to see one another again.
Yes.
And the thing that, when I saw the video, the thing that really made me think of was not only the sort of reuse of the stale bread, but those are really kind of pantry ingredients, right? That whether those would have been available, you would have to tell us if those were available during the 1930s. But a lot of name brand things, right, were available in canned or pickled varieties during those years as well. So I wondered whether or not those things were available to whether it's families like the Baldys or other Americans during that.
Yes, no,
period.
absolutely. There were, and on the Lower East Side, there were wonderful Italian food shops where you could buy all sorts of pantry ingredients, many of the ingredients being imported from Italy, because it was important for Italian American cooks to get food from the soil of their home country. And it was something that they felt very strongly about, that not all immigrant groups shared. So something that jumped out at me as I was doing research.
Yeah, that raises an interesting question before we sort of talk a little bit more about the Baldisi family. One of the things I thought that was really interesting as I was reading your book was the sort of the ways in which Americans who lived in more rural as opposed to urban areas, or even those who might have left urban areas, returned to rural areas where they might have originally hailed from, et cetera, where they were sort of doing, essentially subsistence farming to supplement what they could purchase, and were urban, residents of New York or other cities throughout the country, were they able to do anything that approach that, right? Obviously, they didn't have farming plots, but I'm thinking about growing something on a fire escape or yeah, something of that nature. Is there any kind of connection
Oh
there
yeah,
since you're
and
talking so much about the, yeah.
particularly the Italians had all kinds of window box gardens where they grew basil and peppers and tomatoes. They even erected gardens on on tenement rooftops. So there
Mm,
was very serious vegetable growing going on the Lower East Side. There was also they figured out a way to dry tomatoes, and that's the first step to making tomato paste. So
mm,
somehow they would lay them out on blankets, perhaps on a hot roof, and let them dehydrate and process them into tomato paste that they would use later through the year. So yes, there was a lot of carryover between the Italian countryside and the middle of New York City.
right, right. Yeah, you mentioned buying a family like the Baldeses might have purchased imported goods that were familiar to them
Yes.
from Palermo or elsewhere in Sicily. Um, and I was curious about the ways in which, right, the Depression or the that sort of period, how it kind of generally affected the food world of the Lower East Side. If we were on the Lower East Side right now and it was the 1930s, um, what would we have smelled? What would have been, what we have seen if you want to kind of paint a little bit of a picture for us if we went shopping
Sure.
with very little available in terms of means of purchasing power. What would that
Yes.
have?
Well, by the 1930s, the Lower East Side was really emptying out. That's the first thing to keep in mind when you visualize the neighborhood. Many of the immigrants who had settled in the area in the first part of the 20th century had migrated to the suburbs or to the boroughs, and there were many empty lots and abandoned buildings, which landlords could no longer keep up. And in fact, 97 Orchard was a shadow of what it had been. I think at one time it had 110 tenants.
Right, yeah.
In the 1930s, that had shrunk down to 25. So there was a kind of a sense of emptiness or of
Mm,
emptying out in the neighborhood. On the other hand, the streets were still packed with push carts. And even families who had left the neighborhood came back to do their shopping on the Lower East Side.
mm,
And this is true of both Italians and of Eastern European Jews, the two sort of primary ethnic groups that were in the neighborhood at that period. So there was still lots of food activity. There were still herring barrels on the street and carts of arugula and escarols and bright tomatoes and peppers. It was still, a wonderful kind of outdoor food bazaar. What had happened though for families like the Baldizis was that after a relatively good decade during the 1920s, there was a kind of culinary reversion, meaning families who had begun to eat meat, like Americans, now had to go back to return to the old foods of poverty. And that would have included lots of foods made with bread and breadcrumbs. And in fact, we know that because we have interviews with Josephine Baldy, the little girl of the family, who remembers that breakfast during the Depression was stale bread that was torn up and soaked in hot milk and seasoned with a little bit of sugar and a little bit of butter. And for her, it was a tremendous treat. She
mm.
loved it. It was like a pudding, while the grown-ups dipped their stale bread in coffee. So bread was part of breakfast. Lunchtime might have been sauteed beans and escarole, again, eaten on a nice piece of stale bread to soak up the juices. And then dinner, a nice bowl of Italian lentil soup and a side of bread and olive oil. So bread was really an accompaniment to every meal, and sometimes really was the meal. And that
Mm.
includes a dish that Rosario made for the kids, which Josephine talks about. It was a large loaf of bread, which she kind of sliced in half like a hamburger bun, drizzled with olive oil, and then sprinkled with parmesan, put in the oven, and served to the kids sort of grandly on a
Mm,
tray. That's the way Josephine described it, to show the kids that they had something to be proud of. So in this
mm,
case, it was really a meal made of bread, but presented in such a way that that it was presented with enormous dignity and style. And I think that was very much Rosario's way. She was a woman who arrived in America with a strong sense of her own dignity.
right. Yeah, I wonder, thinking about some of that really kind of creative use of uh, essentially, leftovers, old bread or stale bread, those kinds of things you were talking about just moments ago, and thinking about how, of course, during the Depression, it wasn't only immigrants or those who had essentially been on kind of the edge of were working class or on the edge of poverty
Mhm.
before, thinking about how many Americans who had previously been more economically stable, arguably, if if they sort of look to some of those same things, yeah, how did they kind of view, I guess, some of the what you characterized moments ago as the quote unquote foods of poverty that immigrant
Yeah.
families might have been. Did they look to those things for ideas? Did they?
Well, I would say on the whole, no. And it was a it was a lost opportunity that really could have helped a lot of Americans get through this, very hard time. There was, up until the 1930s, Americans had never really figured out a way to eat that didn't involve a large piece of meat in the center of the plate. And this is, by other standards of the larger world, a tremendous luxury. But even members of the working class, of the urban working class, might have eaten a T-bone steak for breakfast and a ham steak for dinner and a mutton chop for dinner. So it was really meat, meat, and meat.
Hmm.
Um, Unfortunately, there was a lot of disdain expressed toward foods of poverty, and it's hard to tell where attitudes about the food stop and where attitudes about
Right,
immigrants begin. So it's all a kind of a great soup of
right, right,
feelings and attitudes that it's hard to disentangle.
right. Interesting. Yeah, that right sort of dovetails with the general sort of nativist sentiment that was
Very
prevalent
much so.
in
Yeah.
those decades. So it's
Yeah.
not surprising to hear that. As I mentioned previously, and uh, as was the case with other families on the Lower East Side during the very early years of the Depression, the Baldy's we know from Josephine's memories that you were just also talking about. The family availed themselves of home relief, which was, an early form of government assistance provided by New York State during that period via the Temporary Emergency Relief Administration that then Governor Franklin Roosevelt
Yes.
instituted in the early 1930s. And that relief was provided, as I'm sure you know, in kind in the form of clothing and foodstuffs, rather than say cash assistance. And it was one thing that Josephine talks quite a bit in some of her memories, her oral history interviews, and so forth. And so, I was really interested in hearing your thoughts about the ways that you think that families who availed themselves of whether it was relief here in New York State, which served as in some ways kind of a template for what President Roosevelt instituted at the national federal level
Yeah.
once he became president. But also this idea, I really was sort of interested, I think, in the way you kind of teased out in your book the sort of notion of the quote worthy and unworthy poor, and how that really kind of shaped sort of local and federal government food assistance during the Depression years, and how you think those things kind of shaped, what the Baldy's might have received from home relief, and what similar families might have received, and how they use that
Yeah,
essentially.
it's really, that to me was fascinating. Um, to talk about the home relief programs, I think there were really two important shaping influences. And one of them, as you suggest, Dave, was culture, and more specifically, American attitudes toward charity or handouts or the dole. These are all words that carry
Hmm.
a
Hmm.
whole shame about them in our context, in this
Right.
country, which is not true elsewhere. And there's tremendous fear of charity, of what it will do to you, kind of morally, constitutionally, that it might undo you in some kind of way and turn you into an unworthy person if you weren't one to
Hmm.
start with. So there was culture and there was science. And to talk about the science piece first, um, during the Great Depression, nutritionists formulated what were called emergency diets. And these were diets that were all about minimums. What was the least amount of nutrition that you could give the human body and have it still function? Not function at top level, but function. And each age and gender, the person of every age and gender had different requirements, and different requirements for calories, nutrients, minerals, etc. So when these home relief baskets were calculated, they were calculated down to the molecule. Every family member was counted, calculations were done, and the baskets were distributed. So there's that on one hand, the science side. On the other hand, there was tremendous fear at this time, and this is something that goes deep into the American past, about what charity would do to people, how it would remove their incentive to work. And of course, this is thing we hear this today too. This is not something that has disappeared. Um, in terms of the worthy and unworthy poor, the worthy poor were widows, orphans, and cripples. So, sort of victims of God and fate. But they did not include people who were down on their luck, who had lost their job because of a global collapse of the markets. That didn't count somehow in this sort of understanding. So the Baldy's were not members of the worthy poor.
Right.
They were just unlucky. And because taking all this into account, it was very important when putting together these food relief baskets that the foods provide nourishment, but do not provide enjoyment. And a very deliberate effort was made, and it's in the documents that were put together by the Temporary Emergency Relief
Right.
Administration, to refrain from adding seasoning or condiments like vinegar or mustard, pickles or relish from the food allotments, so that people didn't have the idea that they could get too much enjoyment out of this food. It was food that was strictly
Hmm.
meant to be, uh, it was utilitarian and nothing else. So you can see there how the science and the ideology sort of wove together.
Right. 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 That's fascinating, and I think uh, I've seen some of those temporary emergency relief administration food budgets as well, and it's just uh, in some ways it seemed to me it brought a sort of a scientific eye. Or the idea was bringing a scientific eye to something that was more art than science in some ways, the cooking in a way, and kind of laden with all of the sort of biases and ideas about poverty that you were just speaking about. One of the things you mentioned, the sort of calculation of, for various ages, and made me also sort of think about some of the discussion in A Square Meal about school lunch provisions. Thinking about, in this particular case, Josephine and Johnny Baldisi, who would have been students at PS 42, just a few blocks from the Tenement Museum, like a lot of their neighbors of the same age, and sort of thinking about what that might have looked like for them, and the ways in which the years of the Depression might have sort of shaped the whether it's the ideas behind school lunch, what kinds of things would have been provided, what were they, sort of what was the underlying sort of philosophy behind some of those things.
Well, first, a little background. School lunch in New York City was a program that started at the turn of the 20th century. And it happens that it was spearheaded by a kind of hero of mine, a woman named Mabel Hyde Kittredge, who was an uptown socialite who essentially went rogue and moved out of the family townhouse on Park Avenue and moved into the Lower East Side. She actually became a resident of the Henry Street settlement with Lillian Wald. And living on the Lower East Side, she really got a firsthand view of the challenges of keeping house in a tenements and what it was like to feed the kids and how to feed the kids. And she was very impressed by the culinary talents of her immigrant neighbors, who she saw had, she recognized their ability to take these humble materials, transform them into nourishing meals that the family enjoyed. And when she first started the lunch program, it was very important to her that the lunches be culturally relevant and acceptable to the students who were eating them. So Italian students were given plenty of pasta and minestrone, and Jewish kids were given foods that didn't violate the laws of kashrut and didn't mix, meat and dairy.
Right.
She was what I consider a really enlightened lady for her day. Unfortunately, attitudes changed as we move into the teens and the 20s with rising anti-immigrant sentiment. The lunchroom became a place, a forum to Americanize immigrant taste buds. And in a neighborhood like the Lower East Side, that was a real priority. There were all these foreigners here, they ate strangely. Well, we want to teach them how to eat like real Americans and sort of turn them into Americans from the stomach out. So the lunch program shifted to franks and beans. I mean, these aren't bad foods, but they're straight down the middle American fare. Franks and beans, creamed carrots, and various kinds of chowders. So there was a kind of ideological component to the school lunch. At the same time, the lunchroom became a place to teach kids about nutrition during this time when nutrition was so important. So, and I think we're going to be talking a little bit later about the home economics movement, but it was where home economists sort of got their clutches into American children and got them thinking sort of like scientists,
right,
when they sat down to mealtime.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great transition, because that's certainly another thread that runs throughout the books, the idea of home economics, which has I think for a lot of folks has a very different sort of connotation, although
Yeah.
certainly part of that history, right?
Yeah.
If anyone, has taken home economics classes
Right.
as a student, at some point in their lives, but really seemed to be an important part of the story that you endeavor to tell in a square meal, is the role that home economists played in shaping, American food habits during these years.
No, absolutely. And I think it's very true what you say about the connotations. I think we tend to associate home economics with the 1950s and a kind of primness and
Right.
a kind of underhanded way to keep women in the kitchen. And it was anything but feminist. Well, the roots of this home economics movement were something entirely different. Home economics was really a social movement, and it was a
Mm.
revolutionary movement started by American women at the turn of the 20th century to modernize cooking, to take this old fashioned art form and bring it into the modern age by endowing home cooks with scientific knowledge. So this was radical, and it was a way to dignify homework and elevate it, to make it less of what was called drudgery and make it something that was intellectually satisfying to the women performing these tasks. So there's a lot to recommend it. The part, and we've sort of addressed this, that is left out of the home economics formulation is taste. Home economists were just not that interested in the taste of food or in the pleasures of eating or in the sensuality of eating. It just wasn't part of their playbook. They were disciples of science and not of art, as you mentioned earlier. And the food which they pioneered reflected that.
Right, right, right. Yeah, that's uh, puts a whole kind of frame um, around how we think about home economics and
Yes.
about that period in particular. I think that's really sort of interesting in a way to think about, yeah, the kind of trajectory of that whole cultural history. And to kind of shift gears, we want to make sure we have enough time for viewer questions in a few
Sure.
moments. But I had a couple more things I wanted to ask you about that I thought about as I read the book and thinking about some of the stories that we tell at the Tenement Museum. And of course, one of those certainly is the case with the Baldesi family, with other families who called 97 Orchard Street home during this particular period, and really, working class immigrants and migrants and Americans of all sort of different backgrounds of the country, right? Really um, looked to President Roosevelt in some ways as a quote unquote kind of hero
Yeah.
during the Depression, at least certainly when he became president. And in the restored and recreated apartment of the Baldesi family, we have a photo of President Roosevelt, which is very, very common for families
Yeah.
like that at the time. And so, one of the kind of threads as well in your book, I thought that was really interesting was, how the Roosevelts, not just President Roosevelt, but First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, really saw food as part of their kind of leadership
Absolutely.
during that period. And so, yeah, well, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about,
Yeah,
yeah, some of
sure.
that.
I mean, Eleanor's great character too. Eleanor was a very vocal proponent of the home economics movement, and she had some friends, some old home ec friends that she had met at Cornell, which was near the Roosevelt's summer place up on the Hudson, and she saw home economics as a way to bring content into the lives of American homemakers, but also during this national emergency as a way to keep the country healthy. And she became sort of the face of the movement. You may not know it, but she wrote a book called It's Up to the Women. And one chapter was devoted, the food chapter was devoted to home economics. She went on radio shows sort of touting the benefits of eating according to a um, scientific
Right.
standards. And even more, and I think this is where why she really connected with Americans, she brought home economics into the White House and put her husband on a budget diet. And this was not necessarily something he wanted to be on, um, but it was a sort of brilliant public relations play, but it wasn't a play for her, it was genuine. And there was a very
Sure.
famous meal which she served Franklin, that was composed of boiled eggs in tomato sauce. I think it had maybe some creamed
Huh.
carrots and then a prune pudding for dessert. And the entire meal cost 7.5 cents. And the
Wow.
idea was that she wanted to show her solidarity with the
Hmm.
American people. And we sort of think of that kind of leadership and compare it with today. It's different, a very different style of leading.
Sure, sure. Well, that's a great segue, because I think, you can't sort of help but think about that period, and certainly read your book, and not reflect on the current public health and economic crisis that we're all living through today. And of course, the current crisis has shares some echoes
Yes,
from
right.
the 1930s, right? Food access, access to particular ingredients for some, having to make do with less, having enough food to feed your family, and so on. And so, I wanted to kind of ask what you thought about the culinary history of the 1930s. What can that tell us about our own time today, and what can we take from that history, essentially into our own kitchens and our own lives?
Well, I think there are two ways I'd like to answer that. There's first the parallels between the 1930s and today. During the Great Depression, because of widespread deflation, because prices had fallen so low, farmers could not afford to bring their food to market
Hmm.
and destroyed it. So milk was spilled, fields were plowed under, animals were euthanized, and that's exactly what's going on today. And it's really terrible. Um, it's a problem. I mean, it's a problem with there are a lot of weak points in our supply chain, and I think that that's partly what this is about. Um, that food that was being destroyed should have been reallocated to people who are hungry. And eventually it was, when FDR became president. And I believe that now there is food being destroyed today, not for exactly the same reasons, but because the food service industry has sort of collapsed, and farmers are not making their income that they were used to. Now they have to repackage food to the
Right.
consumer, and they can't make the adjustment. So again, food is being destroyed, and I'm hoping that the federal government is finding ways to bring it to food banks. I believe that the beginning of that is taking place. um, I mean, one thing that I think we can learn from it, just in terms of our own kitchens, is flexibility, and not to get ready to punt, and to work with what we've got. And to that end, I would like to recommend a really wonderful article that ran in the New York Times.
Hmm.
I think maybe we could post a link to it on
Perhaps. Sure,
or
we could see
something.
about that.
But it was all about substitutions. What do you do when there's no eggs and you want to make a cake? What do you do when there's no X and you want to make Y? And there's all kinds of ways to substitute when the grocery store is out of flour, but you want to bake a bread. And it was a really well done piece
Ah, sure.
making these substitutions to allow you to go forward, so you don't freeze.
Right. Right. Well, that's really terrific. I want to, we have some really great questions that have come
Good.
in from some of the viewers. So I want to make sure we sort of talk about some of those. So I'll kind of read a couple of those, and you can respond.
Yeah.
One of the first ones here is, was it unusual for Italian American home cooks to use canned American tomato sauce? And was there a price difference between Italian and Hunt's canned tomatoes? I guess the question is really about, canned goods and brand names, kind of mass consumer.
Yeah, I think this is this is how I'll answer that question. Josephine's daughter Maria, who you mentioned earlier in our talk, Dave, sent me a recipe to publish in 97 Orchard. It was a Christmas dish for bacalao, for salt cod, and in the recipe she asks for Hunt's tomato sauce. So Italians evidently were growing a kind of brand
Hmm.
awareness, and it was her mother's recipe, so maybe it came from the 50s. So
Uh,
certainly by that time, Italian Americans were building a kind of allegiance to local brands.
right.
But initially, there was a lot of the preference for Italian-made foods was very strong, and
Mhm.
Italian foods made in this country were dismissed as inauthentic, second rate, and sort of and junk. So I think there was a process where we started at that place and evolved to something a little bit different.
Right, right. That's great. Great. Yeah, another question is, referring to our conversation about the school lunch history of that particular program. One of the viewers asked, what was the name of the woman who helped start the school lunch program? I'm not sure if that rings a bell or not.
Sure, her name was Mabel Hyde Kittredge.
Oh, yes, that's who you mentioned. Yes. Oh,
Yeah,
so they probably won.
and she did all kinds of things on the Lower East Side with immigrants. One of her big contributions was the lunch program, but she
Mhm.
also started something called a housekeeping center, where she taught immigrant girls how to keep their tenement apartment clean, because the challenges of keeping a tenement clean are so much greater than in a sort of traditional home. She felt like she could give them some strategies that would
Mhm.
help in that.
That's great. That's great. Another viewer asks, do you think that our current crisis will shape Americans' cooking habits post-pandemic? So yeah, is any of the sort of a little bit about what you were talking about a few moments ago, is that kind of a lasting change as you see it?
I think that we will take things away from this. The stress baking that's going on.
Mm,
We're learning how to bake bread, and why not continue that? It's really you can get a really good product, and it's fun to do, and it's inexpensive.
right.
We're learning how to work with new ingredients, we're learning how to make substitutions, and to do that you really have to understand how sort of food works. So maybe we're getting a deeper understanding, we're sort of going beyond the recipes or under the recipes to understand more about, I'm not sure if you'd call it food mechanics, but sort of the food dynamics.
Right, right. Oh yeah, that's a
I
really,
think we're going to be
really
smarter
interesting.
cooks.
Yeah, yeah, that seems like it certainly might be the case, and also makes me think of a question that occurred to me while reading your book, and that was, thinking about the lasting impact of that period. I mean, it's a similar question, just some 80 to 90 years in the past, and what's the legacy, the food legacy of that period of the depression, and which of those dishes or food mechanics, I think, is an interesting way, also to think about. It's not just particular recipes and ingredients and so forth, but
Right.
yeah, what has kind of stayed with us from that period?
Well, let me put it this way. I would say sort of three emblematic foods of the Great Depression were lima beans, milk sauce or white sauce, and nut loaves. Now,
Huh.
these none of these foods are part of the American dietary today. These are foods that kind of had their moment, that served a particular need at a particular time, but tastes have changed so much since the Great Depression, and we've sort of swerved off in a different direction. A lot of
Hmm.
it influenced by our by immigration and the immigrant cuisines that have been in
Sure.
this country. Um, so I don't, well, I don't think there's a lot of direct impact,
Hmm.
but there is a very important sort of broader impact. And that's the idea that we look at food through the lens of science.
Right. Right.
And
Right.
that is still very much the American mindset. And I think
Mm-hmm.
it's
Mm-hmm.
getting away from that.
Right, sure. That makes a lot of sense, um, in terms of, yeah, how we view our relationship to food, and some of those kind of strands, that don't maybe seem so apparent, but that seems to be
There's
a kind
one
of a
thing
lasting one. Do you have any? Yeah, please.
that was popular in the Depression and that I would like to see make a comeback,
Mm.
and that is croquettes.
Ah, okay.
Are particularly potato croquettes. So it's made from leftover potatoes, where you mash them with some egg yolk, and you can put in bits of all kinds of leftovers, leftover meats or leftover chopped up vegetables. You dip them in an egg wash, roll them in breadcrumbs, and then pan fry them. And for a really delicious treat, try a sweet potato croquette mixed
Oh,
with
interesting.
spinach. So I'm a I vote for croquettes.
Do you have any other sort of favorite recipes from your book that you'd like to point out, besides the croquettes, which sound delicious?
Recipes. You know, I never made the prune whip, but I want
Ah, okay.
I love the idea of it. You know, the foods were they were really strange.
Hmm.
Um, so I can't say I can't say I fell in love, but these croquettes are fantastic. So I'm sticking with them.
I've had them elsewhere, mainly in Europe, right? In
Yeah,
certain,
that's right.
certain
Yeah,
places have a
but what a
exactly.
great thing to do with leftovers at the same.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I agree. Um, well, it looks like we don't have any more questions from viewers. So I want to thank you for spending this time with us and kind of sharing your thoughts about your work and of course also about how that helps us reflect on the current crisis that we are all living through. So we want to encourage viewers to buy the book again through McNally Jackson. You could do that via their website, or there's a link on the Tenement website as well, Tenement Museum website, which is tenement.org. Um, they're an independent bookstore in New York City, and they'll ship the book immediately. And again, you can visit the museum website for that. We also want to encourage you to consider donating to your local food bank. I think there's a lot of sort of similarities. I thought about that a lot while reading through your book, certainly, and the stories of bread lines and
Yes.
perhaps it's visible or invisible in a different way today. But there are certainly a lot of folks out there who are looking for that help. And we want to ask you to stay tuned for future Tenement Museum virtual events by signing up for our newsletter on tenement.org. And we'll of course hope you join us again. I want to thank you again, Jane. It's been wonderful chatting with you.
It was really fun for me.
Yeah, likewise. So want to say take care and have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.